Introduction: How Learning Works. Life is fundamentally an act of learning, a decades-long process that shapes our education, our careers, and the hobbies we pursue for the sheer joy of mastery. Yet, despite its centrality to our existence, the mechanism of learning often remains elusive. Sometimes we absorb new routines effortlessly, while at other times we languish in libraries or stagnate in our professions, unable to bridge the gap between competency and expertise. Improvement is frequently inconsistent, a reality that makes understanding the underlying principles of how we learn not just an academic exercise, but a practical necessity for anyone seeking to get better. To understand these principles, one need look no further than the surprising evolution of skill in the world of Tetris, where a sudden, collective leap in ability revealed the hidden architecture of human potential. On a winter day in 2020, 18-year-old Joseph Saley sat before a screen, casually chatting with an online audience while navigating a game speed that would have been deemed impossible a generation earlier. As the blocks fell at a blistering pace, Saley did not merely survive. He thrived, pushing past the notorious kill screen at level 29, a point where the game's speed historically overwhelmed the controller's input speed, and playing until level 34. This feat stood in stark contrast to the game's early history following its invention by Alexei Pajitnov in 1984. For decades, even the most obsessed players, those who saw falling blocks in their dreams and nursed blistered thumbs, believed the game had hard physical limits. Records stood for years, managed by gatekeepers like Twin Galaxies, who required cumbersome verification, keeping high-level strategies isolated within small circles. The sudden shattering of these ceilings by Saley and his contemporaries was not the result of biological evolution, but of a fundamental shift in the learning environment triggered by the internet. The explosion of Tetris mastery illustrates the first of three critical factors in skill development: the ability to see. When players began uploading videos to YouTube and live streaming on Twitch, the black box of expertise was pried open. Techniques like hypertapping, once an obscure secret known only to a few like Thor Ackerlund, were suddenly visible, analyzable, and replicable by anyone with an internet connection. This phenomenon underscores a distinct human advantage. Unlike chimpanzees, who struggle to learn socially despite possessing similar raw cognitive solving skills, humans are prodigious imitators. However, this reliance on social learning also means that isolation or poor examples can stifle progress. The history of science offers a parallel. While alchemists obscured their findings in secrecy and code, stalling progress for centuries, chemists like Robert Boyle documented their experiments meticulously, allowing knowledge to accumulate and humanity to advance. Access to the right examples is often the primary bottleneck to mastery. However, observation alone is insufficient. The second pillar of learning is doing. The brain is an efficiency machine, and fMRI scans of Tetris players reveal that as skill increases, neural activity actually decreases, indicating that the brain has automated complex tasks to conserve energy. This efficiency, along with the strengthening of memory through retrieval, can only be achieved through active practice. While imitation provides the roadmap, the physical and mental terrain must be traversed personally to account for individual nuances, whether it is the specific musculature required for a tennis serve or the tacit perceptual skills needed to read an X-ray. This necessity of action creates friction, as it is far easier to passively consume information than to engage in the effortful struggle of practice. Yet it is in that struggle that the mind is reshaped. The third and final pillar is feedback, the corrective mechanism that prevents practice from becoming the mere reinforcement of bad habits. Without clear, immediate feedback, experience does not guarantee improvement. A reality demonstrated by Edward Thorndike's experiments, where subjects failed to draw lines of specific lengths accurately despite thousands of attempts because they couldn't see the results. The transformative power of feedback is evident in the history of the Navy's Top Gun program, where simulated dogfights and rigorous after-action reviews drastically improved pilot survival rates compared to the Air Force, which lagged in adopting similar methods. Whether in medicine, finance, or aviation, the quality of the feedback loop often dictates the trajectory of improvement, separating those who merely age in their profession from those who truly gain expertise. As we look toward a future increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence, the fear that human learning will become obsolete is misplaced. History suggests that technological advances, like the invention of paper or the computer, tend to explode the demand for new types of cognitive labor rather than eliminate it. To navigate this evolving landscape, one must understand the specific dynamics of how skills are acquired. The journey ahead will dissect the cognitive science of improvement, moving from the power of examples and the necessity of copying to the nuances of practice variability and the courage required to face the anxieties of learning. By exploring why problems are best solved as searches, why quantity often breeds quality, and how fears fade with exposure, we can dismantle the intuitive but often incorrect assumptions we hold about our own minds. This exploration serves not just as an academic inquiry, but as a manual for the curious, offering a structured path to mastering the skills that will define the future. Chapter 1: Problem Solving is Search. Life is fundamentally a process of acquiring capabilities, a decades-long endeavor where we strive to master our educations, our crafts, and our passions. Yet the mechanism of learning often remains opaque. Sometimes we absorb new routines with effortless grace, while other times we stagnate despite hours of toil. This inconsistency suggests that improvement is not merely a function of effort, but of understanding the underlying architecture of skill acquisition. A striking example of this evolution can be found in the world of Tetris, a game that remained static for decades before seeing a sudden, explosive leap in human performance. For 30 years, the game was believed to have hard limits, particularly the kill screen at level 29, where the speed became unmanageable. Then, in 2020, an 18-year-old named Joseph Saley shattered these assumptions, not through biological evolution, but because the environment of learning had changed. The isolation of early players was replaced by a hyper-connected culture of live streaming and video sharing, allowing techniques like hypertapping to spread, proving that the capacity to learn from others is the primary engine of human ingenuity. This phenomenon highlights the three pillars of getting better at anything: seeing, doing, and feedback. We are distinct from other intelligent species not because of our raw cognitive power — chimpanzees can match toddlers in spatial reasoning — but because of our unparalleled ability to imitate and learn socially. However, seeing is only the first step. Mastery requires the doing, the active practice that automates mental processes and strengthens memory retrieval. Finally, progress relies on feedback, the corrective loop that distinguishes effective practice from the mere repetition of errors, as demonstrated by the transformation of aerial combat training during the Vietnam War. As we face a future where artificial intelligence reshapes the landscape of work, the ability to learn efficiently becomes not obsolete, but increasingly vital. To understand how we learn to solve the novel problems of the future, we must first understand the cognitive mechanics of problem solving itself. The nature of solving difficult problems is best exemplified by a mathematical mystery that endured for over 3 centuries. When Pierre de Fermat claimed in the margins of a notebook to have a marvelous proof that no 3 positive integers could satisfy the equation an plus bn equals cn dollar for any value of n dollars greater than 2, he set in motion a quest that would stump the greatest minds of history. It was not until 1984, when a connection was proposed between Fermat's equation and the Taniyama-Shimura conjecture regarding elliptic curves, that a path forward emerged. Andrew Wiles, captivated by the problem since childhood, dedicated 7 years of solitary labor to navigating the immense logical geography required to bridge these mathematical islands. His eventual success was not a stroke of magic, but a rigorous navigation of a problem space, a concept formalized by cognitive scientists Herbert Simon and Alan Newell. In this view, problem solving is essentially a search through a maze. The problem space consists of a starting position, a goal state, and a set of constrained moves that allow one to transition from one state to another. Whether solving a Rubik's Cube, designing a building, or proving a theorem, the thinker must navigate a vast array of possibilities. However, because most problem spaces are incomprehensibly large, far too vast to explore via random trial and error, humans must rely on shortcuts. We satisfice, accepting solutions that are good enough rather than optimal, or we rely on knowledge stored in memory to bypass the search entirely. When memory fails, we turn to algorithms, guaranteed step-by-step procedures, though such keys do not exist for many of life's complex locks. When algorithms are unavailable, we depend on heuristics, mental shortcuts that offer no guarantees but often work. Mathematicians might use proof by induction to manage infinity, or seek invariants to simplify complex puzzles like the mutilated chessboard. When facing broader, less defined challenges, humans default to weak methods. We might use generate and test, effectively guessing and checking, or means-ends analysis, where we identify the gap between our current state and our goal and take steps to reduce that distance. We might employ planning to simplify the problem abstractly, or hill climbing, where we simply take the next step that appears to move us closer to the peak. While these strategies are universal, they are often insufficient for complex problems where progress requires moving away from the goal temporarily or navigating deep, counterintuitive valleys. The reality is that general problem-solving ability is largely a myth. What distinguishes an expert like Wiles is not a superior generic search method, but a vast library of domain-specific knowledge that drastically constrains the problem space. We face two types of difficulties: the struggle to learn what is routine for others, and the struggle to navigate the unknown frontier of human knowledge. To tackle the latter, we must first ensure we are representing the problem correctly, as a wrong framing can render a solution invisible. We must also learn to identify promising problems, those ripe for solution based on current tools and knowledge, much as Wiles waited for the link to elliptic curves. Finally, we must explore the space incrementally, like stumbling through a dark mansion room by room until the layout becomes familiar enough to find the light switch. This cognitive framework reveals that solving problems is fundamentally a process of searching through possibilities, constrained by logic and guided by experience. However, understanding the mechanics of the search is only the prelude to acquiring the skill itself. The transition from stumbling in the dark to flipping the switch requires not just the resolution of the puzzle, but the internalization of the path taken. As we shift focus from the act of solving to the act of learning, we encounter a fundamental quirk of human psychology that acts as the ultimate governor on how fast and how well we can absorb new capabilities. Chapter 2: Creativity Begins with Copying. In November 2017, the art world was shaken when Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi previous records and reaffirming the nearly mythological status accorded to the Renaissance masters. We tend to fixate on the singular genius of figures like Da Vinci, Botticelli, and Michelangelo, viewing their output as the result of divine inspiration or innate talent. However, looking past the astronomical auction prices reveals a different story, one rooted not in magic, but in a rigorous, repetitive, and deeply imitative training regimen. The artistic training of the Renaissance was strictly structured around the apprenticeship model. As described by the 15th century painter Cennino Cennini, a novice's journey began not with the freedom to create, but with years of labor, drawing on panels, grinding colors, and crucially, copying. The curriculum moved methodically from copying masterworks to drawing from plaster casts, and finally to working from live models. This progression allowed the apprentice to internalize the translation of light and form before ever attempting to capture the complexity of a living subject or express a unique vision. Da Vinci himself argued that one must first draw from the drawings of masters to acquire practice before attempting to draw from nature. This heavy reliance on copying seems antithetical to the modern romantic ideal of the artist, which prizes originality above all else. The history of this shift in perspective is telling. In ancient Greece and the Middle Ages, art was a craft and the artist a laborer. It was only during the Renaissance, aided by historians like Giorgio Vasari, that the artist was elevated to the status of an intellectual genius. Paradoxically, this elevation eventually led to a pedagogical crisis. If an artist is a genius, can they be trained like a common tradesman? By the era of Romanticism, figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau were arguing against the drawing master and in favor of nature as the only teacher, a sentiment later pushed to the extreme by educators like Franz Zizek, who viewed adult influence as a contamination of the child's creative spirit. Today, the tension persists, with many believing that rigorous training in fundamentals stifles the creative spark. However, cognitive psychology suggests that the Renaissance masters may have understood the mechanics of learning far better than the Romantics. The efficacy of learning through examples was highlighted in the 1980s by psychologist John Sweller, who noticed a strange phenomenon while studying problem solving in students. When given a mathematical puzzle involving transforming numbers, students could solve the problems effortlessly, yet failed to learn the underlying rule governing the solution. Sweller realized that the students were relying on means-ends analysis, a strategy where the mind constantly juggles the current state, the goal state, and the gap between them. While effective for getting an answer, this mental juggling act consumes so much cognitive bandwidth that there is no space left to actually learn the pattern. This insight led to the development of cognitive load theory, which posits that the mind has a severe bottleneck in its ability to process new information. Decades earlier, George Miller had identified the magical number 7 as the limit of items the working memory can hold. To overcome this, the brain must chunk information, binding distinct items into single, meaningful concepts, like remembering the letters F, B, and I as the single chunk FBI. However, beginners lack these chunks. When a novice tries to solve a complex problem from scratch, their working memory is overwhelmed by the mechanics of the search, leaving no resources for deep learning. Sweller demonstrated that students who studied worked examples, problems with the solution, and steps fully displayed outperformed those who solved the problems themselves, even when tested on novel questions later. Far from leading to shallow understanding, studying examples allowed learners to build the cognitive schemas necessary for future flexibility. The limitations of working memory explain why instructional design matters so immensely. Cognitive load theorists distinguish between intrinsic load, the necessary effort to understand the material, and extraneous load, which is the wasted effort caused by poor presentation. For example, the split attention effect occurs when a diagram's labels are separated from the image, forcing the eye and mind to shuttle back and forth, wasting energy. Similarly, the redundancy effect shows that presenting the same information in text and audio simultaneously can actually hinder learning, as the brain struggles to filter out the duplication. Just as Renaissance apprentices learned by watching a master's hand, modern eye-tracking studies suggest that students learn best when they can follow an expert's gaze, bypassing the need to search a complex scene for what matters. Critics often argue that learning by example or instruction is passive and inferior to discovery learning, where students figure things out for themselves. Yet, research by David Clark and Milena Nigam on teaching scientific experimental strategies showed that direct instruction was far more effective than discovery. Students who were taught the strategy not only learned it better, but were able to apply it to entirely different contexts, such as a science fair. The belief that one must reinvent the wheel to understand the wheel turns out to be a fallacy. For complex subjects, whether painting a realistic portrait or learning Japanese grammar, the cognitive load is simply too high for a novice to navigate without the roadmap provided by examples. However, the relationship between problem solving and learning is dynamic. As a learner gains expertise, the expertise reversal effect kicks in. Once the fundamental patterns are stored in long-term memory, the guidance that was once helpful becomes a hindrance. An experienced artist or mathematician benefits more from open-ended problem solving because they have the cognitive chunks to handle the load. The Renaissance model understood this trajectory. Strict imitation in the beginning provided the technical virtuosity that eventually allowed for the visionary creativity of a Da Vinci. Originality is essentially the exploration of unvisited regions of a problem space, but one cannot navigate that space effectively without first mastering the map. Ultimately, the science of learning vindicates the craftsman over the pure romantic. Progress depends on managing the difficulty of the task to fit the available cognitive bandwidth. By seeking out worked examples, simplifying complex materials, and mastering component skills through pre-training, learners can bypass the bottleneck of working memory. While art and technology evolve, the fundamental architecture of the human mind remains constant. Recognizing that creativity stands on the shoulders of technical proficiency that we must copy before we can create, provides not just a method for temporary improvement, but the essential foundation for long-term mastery and the eventual motivation that comes from genuine competence. Chapter 3: Success is the Best Teacher. The trajectory of a life can be altered by a single relationship, a reality vividly illustrated by the story of Helen Keller. Before the arrival of her teacher, Anne Sullivan, Keller existed in a state of dark isolation, cut off from the world by the loss of sight and hearing at 19 months. Communication was limited to primitive signs and frequent, exhausted tantrums born of the frustration of being unable to understand or be understood. The transformation began not with a grand philosophical epiphany, but with a simple, tactile connection between a teacher's hand and a student's palm, spelling out the names of objects. The pivotal moment arrived at a well house, where the sensation of cool water flowing over one hand and the tapping of the word into the other unlocked the realization that things had names, and those names gave birth to thoughts. From this foundational breakthrough, Keller moved from a state of near total isolation to becoming a prolific author, linguist, and activist. Her legacy serves as a testament to the profound impact of bridging the gap between ignorance and understanding through the precise application of instruction. This dramatic transformation highlights a universal truth about learning. The acquisition of complex skills depends heavily on the mastery of foundational ones. Just as the manual alphabet was the key for Keller, literacy is the master key for the modern intellect. Research indicates that early reading ability acts as a bootstrap mechanism for general intelligence. Children who master reading early do not merely acquire more facts, they develop broader cognitive capabilities that compound over time. Conversely, the failure to establish these basics creates a widening deficit. The struggle to read often stems from the counterintuitive nature of alphabetic systems, where arbitrary symbols must be mapped onto speech sounds that are not naturally segmented in the mind. Systematic phonics instruction succeeds because it provides a reliable code for deciphering words, eventually allowing the mechanics of reading to recede into the background. Once decoding becomes automatic, cognitive resources are freed for higher order comprehension and critique, creating a virtuous cycle where competence breeds confidence and further engagement. The challenge for educators has long been how to replicate the extraordinary success of one-on-one instruction, like Sullivan's work with Keller, within the constraints of a crowded classroom. Psychologist Benjamin Bloom quantified this challenge as the 2 sigma problem, noting that tutored students performed 2 standard deviations better than those in conventional classes. To bridge this gap, Bloom proposed mastery learning, a system that rejects the notion of grading on a curve in favor of a model where assessment serves as feedback rather than judgment. In this framework, material is broken down into units, and students must demonstrate proficiency before moving forward. Those who struggle are not penalized, but are given alternative explanations and additional practice until the foundation is secure. By correcting errors early rather than letting them accumulate, mastery learning ensures that the prerequisite knowledge required for future complexity is firmly in place, preventing the demoralizing slide into failure that characterizes the experience of many struggling students. Underpinning the mechanics of learning is the psychology of motivation, which is far less rational than early theories suggested. Motivation is not merely a calculation of the value of an outcome, but is deeply tethered to self-efficacy, the belief in one's own capability to succeed. Psychologist Albert Bandura argued that while encouragement and physiological states play a role, the most potent drivers of self-efficacy are vicarious experiences and personal mastery. Seeing a role model succeed provides a template, but experiencing success oneself provides the fuel. This upends the popular grit narrative. It is not failure that teaches best, but success. Repeated failure, particularly early in the learning process, tends to breed helplessness. In contrast, a track record of small wins builds the psychological armor necessary to withstand later difficulties. Motivation is thus a product of competence, maintained by a sequence of manageable challenges that reinforce the learner's belief in their own agency. To apply these principles, learners must strip away the ego that prevents them from revisiting basics or seeking help. Whether it is a math student ensuring their multiplication tables are fluent or a writer mastering grammar, shoring up foundational skills is the prerequisite for advanced performance. Furthermore, the stigma surrounding tutoring must be discarded. History's intellectual giants, from Robert Boyle to Terence Tao, often benefited from intense, personalized instruction. Finally, confidence should be engineered through the deliberate structuring of practice. By starting with simpler tasks and ensuring high rates of success before increasing difficulty, a learner can ignite the spark of interest into a roaring fire of capability. This exploration of the role of success and foundations in learning pivots the discussion from the acquisition of skills to the nature of expertise itself. As learners progress from halting beginners to fluent practitioners, the very processes that once required immense effort become automatic and unconscious. This transition, while essential for high-level performance, creates a new paradox. The more expert one becomes, the harder it is to articulate the mechanics of that expertise to others. This curse of knowledge presents a significant barrier to teaching and learning, requiring new tools to excavate the invisible intuition that guides the master's hand. Chapter 4. Knowledge becomes invisible with experience. The double helix structure of DNA is perhaps the diffraction of waves bouncing off atoms, requiring a deep, almost intuitive understanding of physics to decode the resulting patterns of light and shadow. Franklin possessed this expertise, honed by years of studying the structure of coal, allowing her to see what others could not. When James Watson and Francis Crick presented their initial flawed three-chain model of DNA, Franklin immediately recognized its impossibility because it failed to account for the water content she knew the molecule required. Her swift dismissal was not a calculated deduction, but an immediate recognition of error, a hallmark of true expertise. This episode illustrates a paradox at the heart of mastery. As proficiency grows, the conscious awareness of how one achieves results often fades. Hungarian philosopher Michael Polanyi famously captured this phenomenon with the phrase, "We know more than we can tell," coining the term tacit knowledge to describe the inexpressible know-how that underpins high-level performance. This concept challenges the view of science and skill in general as a purely rational, explicit process. Instead, great leaps in understanding, like those of mathematician Henri Poincaré, often arrive not through the grinding gears of logic, but through sudden flashes of insight, where the mind subconsciously filters out sterile combinations and presents only the useful ones to the conscious intellect. Expertise, therefore, is not merely the accumulation of facts, but the development of a sophisticated, subconscious perception. Psychological research into expertise, beginning with Adrian de Groot's studies of chess masters in the 1940s, confirms that experts do not necessarily think deeper or search further than novices. Rather, they see differently. Grandmasters do not calculate more moves ahead than club players. They simply recognize the best moves immediately. This ability stems from a vast library of stored patterns, or chunks, that allows them to encode complex situations effortlessly. Where a novice sees a chaotic scattering of 32 pieces, a master sees a familiar forking position or a castled king. This phenomenon of recognition-primed decision-making extends beyond the chessboard to high-stakes environments like firefighting, where veterans can intuitively sense danger and identify a solution without consciously weighing alternatives. It is not magic, but the result of experience stabilizing conflicting interpretations of reality into a single, coherent understanding, much like a fluent reader instantly distinguishes the meaning of the word bank based on the surrounding sentence context. However, this internalization of knowledge creates a significant barrier to learning. Because experts rely on pattern recognition and intuition, they are often terrible teachers. The curse of knowledge blinds them to the difficulties faced by beginners. What is obvious to the master is inscrutable to the apprentice. Franklin saw the flaw in Watson and Crick's model instantly, but the biological novices could not see what she saw until they acquired the necessary background. Furthermore, crucial information is often locked away in unwritten lore, the subtle, practical details that never make it into textbooks, such as the correct chemical form of nucleic acids that eventually allowed the DNA base pairs to click together. This gap between doing and explaining implies that simply asking an expert for advice is often futile, as they may offer platitudes that fail to capture the nuance of their actual decision-making process. To bridge this gap and extract the tacit knowledge of experts, one must employ specific strategies rooted in cognitive task analysis. Direct requests for general advice should be replaced with requests for stories. By asking an expert to recount a specific, challenging incident, walking through the timeline, the cues they noticed, and the decisions they made, a learner can reconstruct the mental models that guided the expert's actions. Similarly, observing experts as they solve real problems allows the learner to witness the application of knowledge in context, revealing steps the expert might otherwise skip in a verbal explanation. Finally, because knowledge is often distributed across a network rather than held by a single individual, mapping out who an expert turns to for answers can be as valuable as the answers themselves. This investigation into the invisible nature of expertise concludes the exploration of how we learn from examples and observation. It highlights that while the mind's bottleneck restricts the novice, it is the very bypassing of this bottleneck through automation and pattern recognition that defines the expert. Having understood how to glean knowledge from others by seeing through the curse of knowledge and decoding the tacit, the focus must now shift from observation to action. The acquisition of skill is not a spectator sport. It requires the transition from seeing to doing, where the principles of practice, difficulty, and repetition come into play to forge the neural pathways of mastery. Chapter 5: The Difficulty Sweet Spot. Octavia Butler's journey to becoming one of the most celebrated science fiction writers in history began in a landscape of profound discouragement. As a black woman in mid-20th century America, she faced not only the economic hardships of a widowed mother working as a domestic servant, but also societal skepticism about her potential to be a writer at all. Yet Butler was driven by an obsession that transcended doubt. Her early years were marked by solitary struggle and frequent rejection, largely because she lacked guidance. It wasn't until she attended the Clarion Workshop that her trajectory shifted. There, amidst established authors who understood the craft, she was pushed to write a story a day and received immediate critical feedback. This intensive environment, contrasting sharply with her previous isolation, catalyzed her first sale and set her on the path to professional success. Her evolution from imitating stories about 30-year-old white men who drank and smoked too much to crafting original narratives like Kindred illustrates a crucial principle of learning. Progress depends on progressively increasing the difficulty of the problems we solve. The central paradox of writing and many complex skills is that experts often behave like novices in their process, engaging in effortful problem solving, while beginners can sometimes appear fluent because they are solving a much simpler problem. Children write easily because they are merely knowledge-telling, writing down thoughts as they come. Experts, however, are knowledge-transforming, wrestling with structure, persuasion, and originality. This distinction highlights that difficulty is relative to the goal. For Butler, writing never became easy because as her skill increased, she chose harder problems to solve, moving from short stories to novels and from simple narratives to complex historical research. This progressive problem solving is essential for mastery. If we stop increasing the challenge, we plateau, much like a driver who can operate a car effortlessly but never becomes a race car driver because the goal remains basic transportation. However, difficulty is not inherently beneficial. Problems that are too far beyond our current abilities or that impose excessive cognitive load can lead to frustration rather than learning. Cognitive load theory suggests we must balance the intrinsic load of the task with our available mental resources. Strategies like desirable difficulties, such as retrieving information from memory rather than rereading it or spacing practice out over time, enhance learning because they engage the brain's effort-saving mechanisms in a way that strengthens retention. Conversely, cramming or mindlessly solving problems without understanding the underlying pattern can be inefficient. The key is to find the zone of learnability or zone of proximal development, where the task is just beyond our current capability, but achievable with effort or support. To navigate this balance, learners can employ specific strategies. The workshop method, as experienced by Butler, provides a structured environment for rapid feedback and iterative improvement, preventing the stagnation of desk drawer syndrome. Another effective approach is copy, complete, create, where learners start by studying or copying examples, like Butler copying story beginnings, then move to completing partial problems, and finally generating original solutions. This gradient reduces cognitive load while building the necessary mental schemas. Scaffolding offers another tool, providing temporary supports, like training wheels or writing prompts, that allow learners to perform complex tasks before they are fully independent. As proficiency grows, these supports are removed, increasing the difficulty to match the learner's expanding capacity. Ultimately, improvement relies on constructing a practice loop that integrates seeing examples, doing the work, and receiving feedback. By continuously cycling through this loop and fine-tuning the difficulty of the tasks, learners can ensure they are neither bored by ease nor paralyzed by impossibility. This process transforms the vague ambition of getting better into a concrete, manageable path toward mastery. As we refine our practice, we must also understand the nature of what we are building. The next phase of our exploration will challenge the common metaphor of the mind as a muscle, revealing instead that the skills we acquire are surprisingly specific, a realization that has profound implications for how we design our training and expectations. Chapter 6: The Mind is Not a Muscle. In January 2016, the Federal Trade Commission could stave off cognitive decline and improve performance in school and professional life. The settlement barred the company from making such claims without reputable scientific evidence, highlighting a disconnect between marketing and reality. Despite the immense appeal of the idea that one could boost general intelligence through simple exercises, scientific consensus suggests that brain training largely fails to deliver. Massive studies involving thousands of participants have shown that while users improve at the specific games they practice, these improvements do not ripple out into real-world cognitive skills or general intelligence. This failure is not merely a case of a specific product overpromising, but rather a symptom of a pervasive and ancient misunderstanding of how the human mind functions. The premise of brain training rests on the seductive analogy that the mind is like a muscle, capable of being strengthened through general exertion. This concept, known as the doctrine of formal discipline, dates back to Plato and was championed by philosophers like John Locke. It suggests that studying rigorous subjects like Latin or geometry serves not just to teach those specific subjects, but to quicken the mind, enhancing memory and reasoning faculties applicable to any endeavor. However, this theory faced a formidable challenge at the turn of the 20th century from psychologists Edward Thorndike and Robert Woodworth. Through a series of experiments, Thorndike demonstrated that training in one task, such as estimating the size of rectangles, provided only negligible improvement in closely related tasks, like estimating the size of different shapes. He concluded that the mind is not a general-purpose muscle, but is essentially specialized, composed of a multitude of independent capacities. Despite Thorndike's findings, the belief in general mental conditioning persists today, often invoked by advocates for teaching chess, music, or computer programming as vehicles for enhancing general cognitive abilities. Yet, modern meta-analyses consistently echo Thorndike. While learning these subjects has intrinsic value, the evidence that they boost general academic ability or critical thinking is weak or non-existent. The failure of skills to transfer broadly led Thorndike to propose the theory of identical elements, arguing that improvement only carries over between tasks that share specific overlapping components. However, later researchers found this definition too restrictive. Charles Judd, for instance, showed that boys taught the principles of light refraction were better able to adapt their aim when throwing darts at underwater targets of varying depths compared to those who merely practiced. Similarly, Max Wertheimer demonstrated that students who understood the logic behind calculating the area of a parallelogram could apply that knowledge to novel shapes, whereas those who memorized the formula by rote could not. These findings suggested that transfer depends heavily on how a skill is represented in the mind. Deep understanding fosters flexibility, whereas rote memorization creates fragile, isolated skills. To resolve the ambiguity of what constitutes an identical element, the cognitive revolution of the mid-20th century introduced more precise models, such as John Anderson's ACT-R theory. Anderson posited that skills are built from production rules, if-then patterns that link conditions to actions. These rules can be abstract, allowing for transfer between domains that share psychological steps, even if they look superficially different. For example, learning one programming language helps in learning another because they share abstract production rules about variables and functions. However, this transfer is often asymmetric. Practicing the creation of sentences in a foreign language aids comprehension, but practicing comprehension does not necessarily build the ability to speak. The mind constructs a library of specific tools rather than building general strength, and the utility of these tools depends on the specific cognitive architecture built through practice. The limitations of transferring knowledge are further illustrated by our frequent failure to recognize analogies. In experiments where subjects were told a story about a general dividing his army to avoid mines while attacking a fortress, few spontaneously applied that same strategy to a subsequent problem regarding using radiation to treat a tumor. However, when explicitly hinted to use the story, nearly everyone solved the problem. This indicates that while the relevant knowledge may sit in memory, it often remains inert, failing to activate in new contexts. This phenomenon explains why logic training often fails to improve performance on abstract tasks, like the Wason card selection puzzle, yet people solve the exact same logical structure effortlessly when it is framed in a familiar social context, such as enforcing a drinking age. We are evolved to detect social rule violations, not to process abstract logic, further reinforcing the idea that our intelligence is specialized rather than general. The practical implications of this research suggest a radical shift in how we approach learning. Because broad transfer is rare, we must focus directly on the specific tasks we wish to improve. If the goal is to learn Spanish, one must practice the specific components of the language rather than hoping that memorizing vocabulary will automatically confer conversational fluency. Furthermore, because abstract skills like critical thinking or physics require concrete grounding to be understood, learners benefit from seeing multiple specific examples to grasp the underlying principles. Finally, we should liberate ourselves from the need to justify hobbies like chess or music as brain training. These pursuits are valuable for their own sake, and mastery of them is its own reward, even if it does not raise one's IQ. Ultimately, the metaphor of the mind as a muscle must be replaced with that of a toolkit. As Thorndike noted over a century ago, the mind does not give something for nothing, but it never cheats. It gives exactly what is put into it. We acquire specific powers through specific efforts. While we cannot simply bench press our way to genius, we can build a sophisticated repertoire of cognitive tools that, in aggregate, constitute expertise. This realization clears the way for a more effective approach to learning, one that moves away from the search for a magic bullet of general enhancement and toward the strategic accumulation of flexible, transferable skills. To maximize the reach of these skills, we must next consider how the variability of our practice sessions can unlock the ability to apply our knowledge in novel and unpredictable situations. Chapter 7: To handle the unexpected. This principle of contextual interference suggests that while repetitive, block practice may lead to faster initial performance, varied practices the brain to solve the problem of which action to take, leading to more durable and flexible skills in the long run. Research in cognitive psychology supports this counterintuitive finding. Studies on motor skills, such as hitting targets in response to colored lights, and cognitive tasks, like troubleshooting chemical plants, consistently show that randomizing practice conditions improves the ability to transfer skills to new situations. This desirable difficulty works because it prevents the brain from relying on rote memorization of a single pattern. Instead, it forces the learner to constantly retrieve and apply the underlying rules of the skill. Similarly, learning to recognize concepts, whether it's distinguishing a Charlie Parker lick from a Sonny Rollins lick, or identifying organic molecules, benefits from interleaving, where different types of problems are mixed together. This juxtaposition helps the learner notice the subtle features that distinguish one concept from another, sharpening their perceptual discrimination. Another layer of flexibility comes from developing multiple mental representations of the same problem. Just as a physicist benefits from knowing several theoretical frameworks for the same phenomenon, a musician benefits from understanding music both orally and theoretically. Players who learned solely by ear often struggled with complex harmonies until they learned the theory behind them, while classically trained musicians often found their reliance on sheet music a handicap in improvisation. Having multiple ways to think about a problem, viewing pitch relationships as chords, scales, or intervals, provides a richer toolkit for creative expression. This cognitive diversity allows the expert to reframe a difficult situation in a way that makes the solution obvious, much like realizing that the game of number Scrabble is structurally identical to tic-tac-toe. However, the application of variability is not without its limits. For beginners or for skills that are extremely difficult to execute even once, blocked practice is often necessary to establish a baseline of competence. A jazz soloist starts by imitating a recording note for note before attempting to improvise over it. Variability should be introduced gradually as proficiency grows, challenging the learner to adapt their established skills to new contexts without overwhelming them. Ultimately, the goal is not to replace repetition with variability, but to build variability on top of repetition. This synthesis allows for the development of skills that are not only robust and reliable, but also capable of the fluid adaptation required for true mastery and invention. As we move from improvisation to the creation of something entirely new, we will see how this flexibility serves as the bedrock for genuine creativity.